Our history books are filled with the rise and fall of great empires, but they are missing the most dramatic chapters. Entire societies have been erased from memory by forgotten cataclysms, global disasters that reset civilization itself. This journey will uncover the evidence of these earth-shattering events, from sudden ice ages triggered by comets to volcanic eruptions that plunged the world into winter. You will discover how forces beyond human control have repeatedly reshaped our world, revealing the astonishing fragility of even the most powerful empires. We will investigate why a sophisticated culture in North America vanished almost overnight, and what could have inspired the legend of a sunken city like Atlantis. By the end, you will see the entire sweep of human history in a startling new light, understanding the precarious thread by which our own modern world hangs. What does it truly mean for a civilization to be permanent? A serene prehistoric world, a landscape of thriving grasslands and emerging human cultures, was torn apart in an instant. The sky itself turned to fire as a colossal comet, or perhaps a swarm of its fragments, screamed into Earth's atmosphere. This is the heart of the Younger Dryas Impact hypothesis, a revolutionary idea that challenges everything we thought we knew about our ancient past. Around 12,800 years ago, according to this theory, a day of cosmic violence changed the planet forever. The evidence for this cataclysm is etched into the Earth itself. Geologists like James Kennett have identified a thin, dark layer of sediment they call the black mat. This layer is not confined to one valley or one continent. It has been found across the globe, from North America to Europe and beyond. And within this black mat are the fingerprints of an extraterrestrial impact, microscopic diamonds that only form under immense pressure and heat, along with other exotic materials that point to a sky filled with falling fire. The immediate aftermath was hell on Earth. The immense energy released by the impact or airbursts ignited wildfires on a continental scale, burning entire biomass to ash. Soot and dust filled the atmosphere, blocking the sun's life-giving rays, but the true devastation was yet to come. This celestial hammer blow seemingly triggered a climatic chain reaction, plunging the world back into a deep freeze. This period, known as the Younger Dryas, was a sudden and brutal return to Ice Age conditions right as the planet was beginning to warm. The effects were catastrophic for the planet's megafauna. Creatures that had survived for millions of years, like the mighty mammoths and formidable saber-toothed cats, suddenly found their world transformed. Their habitats vanished, their food sources disappeared, and they were driven to extinction within a geological heartbeat. Human societies were not spared. In North America, the sophisticated Clovis culture, known for their distinctive stone spear points, vanished almost without a trace. These were skilled hunters and toolmakers, a people who had mastered their environment. Yet, the archaeological record shows their presence ends abruptly right at this time, their tools lying just beneath that global layer of black sediment. It is as if a line was drawn in the earth, with one world below it and a completely new one above. The climatic chaos also unleashed another terrifying force: water. As the brief warming period before the impact had melted ice, and as the new freeze altered weather patterns, global sea levels rose dramatically. Vast coastal plains that had served as highways and homelands for millennia were swallowed by the ocean. One of the most famous of these lost worlds is Doggerland, a sprawling, fertile landscape that connected Britain to mainland Europe. It was a rich ecosystem, likely home to thousands of people, and now it lies at the bottom of the North Sea, a sunken kingdom lost to a rising tide. How could a single day, a moment of cosmic violence, erase so much? How many generations of human knowledge, how many unique cultures and ways of life were simply washed away? This event was not just an extinction, it was a hard reset for humanity. The survivors, scattered and struggling in a broken world, were forced to adapt in entirely new ways. And from the ashes of this global catastrophe, something new and mysterious began to emerge in a distant corner of the world. While the survivors of the Younger Dryas were rebuilding, another kind of cataclysm was brewing, one that moved with a silent, creeping lethality. Millennia later, the world's first great empires stood triumphant, yet they were about to be defeated by an enemy they could not see. The Akkadian Empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, was an unprecedented achievement, a colossus of administration and military might. But its true conqueror was not a rival army, it was the sky itself. Around 2,200 years before the Common Era, the planet was gripped by a profound and relentless mega-drought, a climatic event so severe that scientists now call it the 4.2 kiloyear event. This was not a fleeting dry spell. It was a century-scale collapse of the very weather patterns that had allowed civilization to flourish. We can read this ancient story today, not in clay tablets, but in the Earth's own archives. Ice cores drilled from deep within glaciers contain tiny bubbles of ancient air, preserving a year-by-year record of the world's climate. Sediment layers from lake beds and ocean floors tell a similar tale of suddenly expanding deserts and vanishing rains. Archaeologist Harvey Weiss and others have pieced together this evidence to reveal a global crisis. The mighty Akkadian Empire, utterly dependent on the Fertile Crescent's bounty, simply withered away. Its cities were not sacked, they were abandoned, left to be buried by the very dust that had once been their farmland. At the ancient site of Tel Leilan in modern Syria, a thick, sterile layer of wind-blown silt suddenly covers the ruins, a stark line in the dirt that screams of desertification. The empire's intricate network of trade and controls shattered as people fled in a desperate search for water. But this was not a localized tragedy. The same climatic shockwave rippled across the ancient world. In Egypt, the glorious old kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders, crumbled. The Nile's annual floods, the lifeblood of the kingdom, failed with terrifying consistency. For decades, the river did not rise to water the fields, leading to famine, social chaos, and the collapse of central authority that had lasted for centuries. Far to the east, the meticulously planned cities of the Indus Valley civilization, with their advanced drainage systems and standardized weights, also met a mysterious end. Great urban centers like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were gradually depopulated. Archaeological evidence shows a dramatic shift in settlement patterns, as people dispersed into smaller, more mobile villages, likely following the retreating rains. Isotopic analysis of human bones from this period tells a grim story of widespread malnutrition and stress. How does an entire city, a whole civilization, simply empty out? It does not happen overnight with the clash of swords, but slowly, agonizingly, with the endless thirst of cracked earth and the desperate hunger of its children. The parallel to our own time is unsettling. We watch modern reservoirs dry up and wildfires rage, and we are forced to ask, what does it mean when the environment that supports a society fundamentally changes? These ancient empires fell because their climate security vanished. They remind us that the greatest threats are not always human. As one world order dissolved into dust, however, a new and terrifying power was rising from the sea, born not from drought, but from a fire that would darken the sun. The Mediterranean world held its breath as a new empire of the sea emerged, one built not on conquest but on commerce and breathtaking artistry. The Minoans of Crete were the undisputed masters of the Bronze Age, their palaces sprawling and labyrinthine, their frescoes alive with leaping dolphins and graceful athletes. Their thalassocracy, a network of trade routes, connected the known world, yet their brilliance was extinguished not by a human rival, but by a single, catastrophic day of fire. The volcano on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, did not simply erupt, it disintegrated. Around 1600 years before the Common Era, the mountain unleashed one of the most violent geological events in human history. Volcanologists like Floyd McCoy classify this eruption with a volcanic explosivity index of 7, a scale that only goes to 8. To put that in perspective, this single event was perhaps 4 times more powerful than the notorious Krakatoa eruption of 1883. The sequence of destruction was a masterclass in terror. First, the initial blast would have been heard across continents, a thunderclap announcing the end of the world. Then the island's core collapsed into the sea, creating a void that the ocean rushed in to fill. This generated tsunamis of almost unimaginable scale. Walls of water, tens of meters high, raced across the Aegean Sea, slamming into the northern coast of Crete just 70 miles away. These waves would have scoured the coastline clean, obliterating the Minoan fleet, their very source of power and wealth, and drowning their vital port cities. But the sea was only the first blow. The sky then delivered the second. The eruption column punched high into the atmosphere, spreading a blanket of volcanic ash across the entire eastern Mediterranean. This was not a light dusting, it was a heavy, suffocating layer that buried fields, poisoned the soil, and blotted out the sun for years. Agriculture, the foundation of Minoan society, collapsed. Famine and disease would have ravaged the population that the tsunamis had spared. The archaeological record bears silent witness to this apocalypse. On Thera itself, the town of Akrotiri was buried in pumice and ash, a Bronze Age Pompeii frozen in a single, horrifying moment. Its beautifully preserved buildings and vivid frescoes speak of a sophisticated life instantly entombed. On Crete, while the great palace of Knossos was not destroyed by the eruption itself, there is clear evidence of massive fire damage and subsequent decline. The Minoans' political and economic influence shattered, leaving them vulnerable to conquest by the emerging Mycenaeans from the Greek mainland. The echoes of this event may have traveled even further. An Egyptian inscription known as the Tempest Stele describes a period of unprecedented darkness, violent storms, and chaos, events that align eerily well with the aftermath of the Thera eruption. This forces us to ask a profound question. Are we too quick to dismiss the myths of our ancestors as mere fantasy? The story of a fabulously advanced island kingdom, consumed by the sea in a single day and night of misfortune, sounds strikingly familiar. Could the Thera eruption be the cataclysmic kernel of truth around which the legend of Atlantis grew? The ash from Thera eventually settled, but the waves of its impact reached the shores of a rising superpower, reshaping the political landscape for centuries to come. The intricate world of the late Bronze Age was a marvel of globalization. Great kingdoms like the Hittites in Anatolia and the Mycenaeans in Greece traded goods, exchanged letters, and forged treaties across the Mediterranean. This was a sophisticated international system, a web of connections that seemed unbreakable. Then, around 1177 years before the Common Era, it all came crashing down in what historian Eric Klein calls a history of systems failure. This was not the fall of a single empire, but the simultaneous collapse of nearly every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire, a superpower of the ancient world, vanished. The magnificent palatial centers of Mycenaean Greece were burned and abandoned. Even the mighty new kingdom of Egypt was brought to its knees, surviving only by the skin of its teeth. This was the late Bronze Age collapse, and it was caused by a perfect storm of catastrophes. Climate science reveals a period of severe drought and cooling that gripped the region. Tree rings from that time show stunted growth, and sediment cores tell a story of failing rains. This climatic shift led to widespread crop failure and famine, the first domino to fall. At the same time, the earth itself seemed to revolt. Archaeological evidence from city after city shows signs of massive earthquake damage, occurring in a cluster that shattered critical infrastructure like palaces and defensive walls. With central authority weakened by hunger and natural disaster, internal rebellions and social unrest tore societies apart from within. But the most famous agents of this destruction were the enigmatic sea peoples. Egyptian temple reliefs depict them as a confederation of different tribes, arriving in ships and ox carts, a whole people on the move. They were not a single army but a wave of displacement and chaos, attacking coastlines and disrupting the vital sea lanes that were the lifeblood of Bronze Age trade. We can hear the desperation of the age in the clay tablets they left behind. A letter found in the burned ruins of the city of Ugarit is a desperate plea for help from the Hittite king. It reads, "My father, the enemy's ships are already here. They have set fire to my cities and have done great damage in the country. My father, you must know that all my troops are stationed in the Hittite lands, and all my ships are still in Lycia." The letter was never sent. The city was destroyed and the kingdom fell. This scene was repeated from Greece to the Levant. Layer upon archaeological layer of intense fire and destruction mark the end of an era. How does such an interconnected, advanced world simply cease to exist? It succumbs not to one enemy, but to a cascade of failures where climate change, natural disaster, and mass migration combine to overwhelm even the most robust systems. The collapse was so total that literacy itself was lost in Greece for centuries. The intricate network of global trade shattered into isolated, impoverished villages. It was a dark age that lasted for generations. Yet, from this vacuum of power, new forces would eventually arise, including a small city on the Tiber River that would one day build an empire of its own. The sophisticated world of the Etruscans was a tapestry of vibrant cities and rich culture, yet it unraveled thread by thread. These masters of metallurgy and art, whose influence once rivaled early Rome, did not fall to a single invading army. Their decline was a slow, quiet suffocation, driven by a forgotten enemy, a changing climate. Around 500 years before the Common Era, the weather itself turned against them. Paleoclimatologists have pieced together this ancient crisis from the silent testimony of lake sediments and the rings of ancient trees. These natural archives tell a story of erratic weather and a pronounced cooling across central Italy, a climatic shift that struck at the very heart of Etruscan power. Their prosperous society was built on a foundation of reliable harvests from fertile plains. But as the growing seasons shortened and rains became unpredictable, that foundation began to crack. Fields that once yielded bounty now produced scarcity, leading to food shortages and crippling economic strain. How does a civilization built on abundance cope when the land itself withdraws its favor? The answer is written in the landscape. Archaeological evidence reveals a dramatic shift in settlement patterns. Grand Etruscan hilltop cities, centers of commerce and government, were gradually abandoned. People moved to smaller, more defensible locations, a clear sign of a society turning inward, fracturing under the pressure of internal hardship. This internal vulnerability created an opening for external forces. The rising Roman Republic, hungry for land and resources, began to push aggressively against a weakened neighbor. From the north, Celtic tribes, perhaps also feeling the pinch of a cooling Europe, pressed down into Etruscan territories. The Etruscans, consumed by the struggle to feed their own people, could not muster the unified strength to resist for long. Their cities were not destroyed in a great conflagration. They were simply absorbed, their culture diluted and overwritten by the ambitions of Rome and the migrations of newcomers. It forces us to reflect on how much of history is determined not by great leaders or brilliant inventions, but by simple environmental luck. A few centuries of stable weather can allow an empire to rise, while a few decades of bad harvests can bring it to its knees. While Europe grappled with a creeping chill, an entirely different kind of cataclysm was gathering force across the Atlantic, one that would unleash a firestorm capable of transforming an entire continent in a single afternoon. Deep in the humid jungles of Central America, the classic Maya built a civilization of staggering intellect and artistry. By the 9th century, their cities pulsed with life, their pyramids scraping the sky and their calendars tracking cosmic cycles with breathtaking precision. Yet, within just 100 years, the great ceremonial centers fell silent. The jungle reclaimed plazas and palaces, and a society that had flourished for centuries simply walked away from its own grandeur. The mystery of their collapse now has a compelling answer, one written not in stone but in mud at the bottom of the sea. Sediment cores drilled from the Cahokia Basin off the coast of Venezuela tell a terrifying story. Researchers like Gerald Hogg have analyzed these layers, finding that the period of the Maya collapse coincides precisely with a series of profound, multi-generational mega-droughts. These were not brief dry spells, they were climatic catastrophes that stretched for decades, shattering the very foundation of Maya life. The Maya were masters of water management, constructing intricate reservoirs and canal systems to survive the regular dry seasons. But their engineering genius was no match for a climate that had fundamentally broken. The vicious cycle began with the failure of the rains. Year after year, the skies withheld their life-giving water. Crops withered in the fields, leading to widespread famine. This nutritional crisis is etched into the bones of the Maya themselves. Isotopic analysis of skeletons from this period shows clear signs of chronic starvation and physiological stress. A society that was once well-fed was now starving. Hunger quickly bred social unrest. The divine authority of the Maya kings was built on a promise. Their unique connection to the gods would ensure rain and abundant harvests. When the rains failed, their power evaporated. We see evidence of their desperation in the archaeological record. In a final, frantic attempt to restore cosmic order, they performed more frequent and more elaborate rituals. But the gods remained silent. The last dated monuments, the stelae that celebrated their reigns and conquests, were carved and then never again. At mighty cities like Tikal and Kapan, the practice of erecting these stone chronicles simply stops, as if history itself had ended. The collapse accelerated into a storm of internal warfare. As resources dwindled, city turned against city in brutal conflicts fought not for glory, but for the last remaining pools of water and arable land. Former allies became enemies and the social fabric tore beyond repair. One by one, the urban centers were abandoned. The people did not vanish, they simply dispersed, leaving the stone wonders of their ancestors to the creeping vines. They returned to a simpler, more mobile way of life, their grand ambition stripped away by an unrelenting drought. This forces us to ask a difficult question about leadership in a crisis. When faced with an existential threat that challenges the core beliefs of a society, can any leader, no matter how powerful, hold a civilization together? The Maya kings, trapped by their own mythology, had no answer when their world dried up, and as the jungles closed in over the Maya pyramids, a similar story of climatic betrayal was unfolding in the arid landscapes of the American Southwest. High on the sun-baked cliffs of Mesa Verde, an entire society carved its home into the stone. The ancestral Puebloans constructed a breathtaking world of apartment-like dwellings nestled in towering alcoves, a masterpiece of human ingenuity. Yet by the 1300s, these intricate cities were empty, their ladders pulled up and their hearths grown cold. The silence that followed was not a mystery of invasion, but a tragedy written in the rings of ancient trees. Dendrochronologists, scientists who study tree rings, have read this story with astonishing precision. The wide rings of wet years and the desperately narrow rings of dry ones create a perfect calendar stretching back centuries. Their data reveals a crushing truth. A great drought gripped the Southwest for nearly 30 years, a period of aridity so profound it broke a civilization. The ancestral Puebloans were masters of a difficult land. They engineered elaborate check dams to capture scarce rainwater and practiced sophisticated dry land farming to grow corn, beans, and squash in the parched earth. For generations, their adaptations were a brilliant success, but this very specialization became their greatest vulnerability. When the climate shifted into a deep, sustained drought, their entire system was pushed beyond its limits. The check dams held back only dust, the carefully tended fields lay barren. The sophisticated knowledge that had sustained them for centuries was suddenly useless. As the drought tightened its grip, the social fabric began to tear. At some sites, archaeologists have found evidence of violence, including unburied bodies and signs of conflict. In a world where a single water source meant the difference between life and death, it seems communities may have turned on each other, fighting for the last remaining resources. Desperation also forced a dramatic change in diet. Analysis of turkey bones from this period shows a clear shift. Initially, these birds seem to have been raised for their feathers, but as crops failed, the bones show signs of intensive butchering. The people were now eating their former assets, a clear signal of a society on the brink of starvation. Faced with this existential crisis, the ancestral Puebloans made a monumental decision. They chose to leave. They did not vanish, they migrated, dispersing from their great cliff houses and joining other communities along rivers with more reliable water, like the Rio Grande Valley. Their story forces us to consider the sustainability of any civilization living on the edge. How many of our own modern cities, built in deserts or on precarious coastlines, are testing the limits of their environment? The ancestral Puebloans adapted by walking away, but other cultures were not so fortunate. Some were so completely erased that their very existence became a secret, waiting centuries for a chance discovery to bring them back into the light. The silence that followed Helike was a legend for centuries. This was not a slow abandonment or a conquest, but a complete and utter erasure. In the winter of 373 before the Common Era, the powerful and wealthy city-state of Helike, a leading member of the Achaean League, was simply gone. Ancient writers like the Roman Pausanias recorded the event with awe, describing how a massive earthquake struck at night, and then a colossal wave from the Corinthian Gulf swept inland, drowning the entire city and every soul in it. By morning, where a bustling metropolis had stood, there was only sea. The city's patron god was Poseidon, the earth shaker and lord of the oceans, and in a cruel twist of fate, it was his two domains that conspired to destroy his greatest sanctuary. Survivors reported a chilling sight: the bronze statue of the god himself, still standing on the seafloor, his hand outstretched beneath the waves as if beckoning or warning. For over 2,000 years, Helike was a ghost, a tale thought to be mere folklore. Then, in the 1990s, a team of archaeologists and geologists finally pinpointed its location, not deep under the open sea, but buried beneath layers of silt and sediment in a coastal plain. Their excavations revealed the stark truth: building foundations, shattered pottery, and ancient roadways, all preserved in a tomb of clay. This was not a myth, it was a crime scene, and the evidence pointed to a terrifying sequence of geological violence. The Corinthian Gulf is a highly active tectonic rift, where the Earth's crust is literally being pulled apart. The earthquake that struck Helike was not a random event, but an inevitable release of the immense strain building along this fault. The shaking itself was catastrophic, but the true killer was likely a submarine landslide triggered by the quake, a sudden collapse of the seafloor that displaced an enormous volume of water, generating a local tsunami that slammed into the coast with unimaginable force. The city, built so proudly near the shore, had no chance. It was submerged in moments, and then silt carried by inland rivers quickly buried the ruins, sealing them away from memory. The parallels to another famous lost city are striking. Plato would write his allegory of Atlantis just a few decades after Helike's destruction. Is it possible that the terrifying, real-world fate of a sophisticated Greek city, swallowed by the sea in a single night, provided the raw material for his philosophical story? Helike stands as a permanent monument to the precarious existence of coastal civilizations. We build our greatest cities on shores and river deltas, drawn to the sea for trade and sustenance, yet we place ourselves directly in the path of titanic, unpredictable forces. What does the silent, sunken rubble of Helike say to modern megacities built on similar active faults, from San Francisco to Tokyo? The ground beneath our feet is not always solid, and the sea is not always a friend. And as the people of Helike learned, the climate is not the only thing that can turn on a dime. The world grew dark and cold in the year 536. For 18 long months, a strange, dusty veil dimmed the sun's light, casting a perpetual twilight over the earth. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote of a sun that gave no more light than the moon, and of a summer that brought frost and ruin. This was not a local phenomenon. Tree rings from Scandinavia to Siberia tell the same story of sudden, desperate cold. The rings from those years are shockingly narrow, evidence that growth nearly stopped for over a decade. Across the oceans, Irish monks chronicled a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. Something had cast a shadow over the entire planet. The mystery of this global winter has now been solved by reading the Earth's own frozen history. Deep within the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists drill out long cores, each layer a frozen snapshot of the ancient atmosphere. In the ice dating to the spring of 536, they find a staggering spike of sulfate deposits. This is the chemical fingerprint of a volcanic eruption of almost unimaginable scale, an explosion so powerful it injected millions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide directly into the stratosphere. There, the gases transformed into a reflective aerosol haze that encircled the globe, bouncing sunlight back into space and plunging the world into a volcanic winter. The exact volcano remains a subject of debate, with candidates in Iceland or perhaps North America, but its global impact is undeniable. This single atmospheric event triggered a cascade of historical consequences. With summer frosts killing crops year after year, famine became a global specter. Malnourished and weakened populations became tinder for an epidemiological fire. Just a few years after the dust veil appeared, the first great plague of recorded history erupted. The Justinian plague, a terrifying early form of the Black Death, swept through the weakened Byzantine Empire. It killed millions, decimating its army, emptying its farms, and crippling the Emperor Justinian's dream of restoring the Roman Empire. The empire's tax base collapsed, its military power waned, and it began a long, irreversible decline. The shockwaves did not stop at the Mediterranean. On the other side of the world, dynasties in China faced revolts fueled by hunger. In Scandinavia, the deteriorating climate may have spurred the legendary folk migrations that would eventually reshape Europe. How fragile is the intricate web of civilization when the very climate that supports it is pulled away? We live in a world where a similar event, a large volcanic eruption or even a nuclear conflict, could create a comparable high-altitude aerosol layer with consequences we can scarcely imagine. The dust veil of 536 was a stark reminder that our world is interconnected by the air we breathe and the climate we share, a prelude to an age of upheaval that would ultimately forge new kingdoms from the ashes of the old. High in the cloud-wrapped valleys of the ancient Andes, a spiritual revolution was underway. The Chavin culture had forged a vast network of influence, its heart the magnificent temple complex of Chavin de Huanta, a place of underground galleries and stone gods with snarling jaguar mouths. Pilgrims traveled for weeks to reach this center of power, drawn by an elite who seemed to command the very forces of nature. Then, around 200 years before the Common Era, the heart of this world stopped beating. The temples were abandoned, the pilgrimages ceased, and the intricate artistic style that had defined an era simply vanished. This was the formative stage collapse, and its cause may lie in the periodic warming of the Pacific Ocean we now call El Niño. For the people of the coast, El Niño was a double-edged sword. The warm currents could bring life-giving rains to the desert, but when the cycle became extreme, it brought not gentle showers but a deluge. Geoarchaeologists studying the site have found stark evidence within the temple walls themselves, layers of sediment and gravel deposited not by gentle streams, but by catastrophic flash floods. Imagine the scene: torrential rains pounding the mountains for weeks, turning tranquil rivers into raging, mud-brown torrents that burst their banks and scoured the landscape. The sophisticated irrigation canals that fed the fields would have been obliterated in hours. The season's crops, the foundation of the food supply, would have been washed away or drowned in standing water. But the destruction of the harvest was only the first disaster. The true collapse was one of faith. The Chavin elite derived their authority from a perceived ability to communicate with the gods and control the weather. What happens to a priestly class when the skies they claim to command unleash utter chaos? Their spiritual currency becomes worthless. The massive flooding was not just an environmental event, it was a direct refutation of their divine mandate. We see the aftermath written clearly in the archaeological record. The great ceremonial center of Chavin de Huanta was gradually deserted. The production of its distinctive art, the intricate carvings and stunning pottery, went into a steep decline. And across the region, people began to move, abandoning vulnerable valley floors for more defensible, fortified hilltops. This shift in settlement patterns speaks to a new, more dangerous world, one where conflict over scarce resources had replaced the unifying power of shared belief. How does a society recover when its central organizing principle, its religion, is proven false by a force of nature? The people of the Andes did not vanish, they adapted, fragmenting into smaller, more resilient groups. Their story is a powerful lesson in the vulnerability of ideological power. While the Chavin world was dissolving in floodwaters, a different kind of cataclysm was preparing to strike in the vast, frozen forests of Siberia, one that would not merely topple a culture, but leave a scar visible from space. The sky tore open over Siberia. On the morning of June 30, 1908, a fireball brighter than the sun raced across the heavens above the remote Tunguska River basin. Moments later, a cataclysm unfolded. A blast of unimaginable force, equivalent to a modern thermonuclear weapon, ripped through the atmosphere. A shock wave of superheated air radiated outward, flattening over 2,000 square kilometers of ancient forest. Millions of trees were snapped like twigs and laid out in a vast, radial pattern of destruction, all pointing away from the epicenter of an explosion that occurred miles above the ground. For days afterward, the world witnessed the aftermath. Night skies across Europe glowed so brightly that people could read newspapers at midnight, the result of vast amounts of ice and dust from the vaporized object still high in the atmosphere. This was the Tunguska Event, and its most chilling feature is what is not there. There is no crater. The object, likely a stony meteoroid or a fragment of a comet roughly 60 meters across, never struck the Earth. It disintegrated in a massive airburst, its kinetic energy converting instantly into a titanic shockwave that hammered the landscape below. This single fact transforms Tunguska from a historical curiosity into a sobering lesson. The devastation was caused not by a direct hit but by an atmospheric explosion. Scientific expeditions to the site, beginning with Leonid Kulik's first trek in 1927, found the ground scarred but empty, the forest flattened but with no obvious point of impact. The energy of the event is estimated to have been up to 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. What if that airburst had occurred just a few hours later in its rotation, over a densely populated city like London or Moscow? The entire metropolitan area would have been erased in an instant with casualties in the millions. This forces a difficult question: how prepared are we for the next one? Astronomers and planetary defense specialists use Tunguska as a fundamental case study. They scan the skies for near-Earth objects, modeling the effects of similar impacts to understand the threat. We now know that objects of this size are statistically likely to strike Earth every few centuries. The Tunguska event was a cosmic warning shot, a demonstration of our planet's vulnerability that, by sheer luck, landed in one of the most remote places on Earth. It reminds us that the forces which reset ancient civilizations are not confined to the past. They are a permanent part of our cosmic environment, and our modern, interconnected world is arguably more fragile than any Bronze Age empire. While the trees in Siberia have slowly grown back, the memory of that morning's fireball serves as a permanent reminder that some threats come from the sky without warning. The volcanic ash from Thera did not simply settle on the Aegean Sea. It traveled the globe, a silent passenger in the upper atmosphere. While the Minoans faced their immediate doom, a climatic shockwave was propagating across the hemispheres, potentially touching civilizations that had never even heard of Crete. Climate modelers running sophisticated simulations have shown how the eruption's vast plume of sulfate aerosols could have encircled the Earth within weeks, reflecting sunlight back into space and creating a pronounced volcanic winter that may have lasted for years. The evidence for this global reach is locked in the ice. Deep cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet reveal a distinct, acidic layer from around 1,600 years before the Common Era, a chemical timestamp that matches the Thera eruption. This frozen archive proves that Thera's influence was not regional but planetary. Could this cold snap have echoed in the meticulous records of the Shang dynasty in China? Ancient Chinese texts from this period describe a sudden and unexplained period of prolonged cold, failed harvests, and social unrest. The dates are not a perfect match, falling within a window of a few decades, which leads to intense debate among historians. Is this correlation, or could it be causation? A volcanic winter triggered by a Mediterranean event contributing to turmoil on the other side of the world. The domino effect may have been even more direct closer to the source. In Egypt, the prosperous Middle Kingdom was crumbling, giving way to the chaotic Second Intermediate Period, a time when foreign rulers known as the Hyksos took control of the Nile Delta. While the Hyksos invasion was a complex political and military event, some scholars suggest that the environmental stress in the aftermath of Thera could have been a critical factor. A period of cooler temperatures and erratic Nile floods would have meant famine, a weakened central government, and a population more susceptible to upheaval. This line of thinking even touches one of history's most famous stories. A small but fascinating body of research has speculatively linked the biblical plagues of Egypt to the chain of events set off by Thera. The idea is that volcanic ash falling into the Nile could have turned the waters acidic and reddish, killing fish and driving frogs onto land. Subsequent ashfalls could have blotted out the sun, creating darkness, while climate disruption could have spurred locust swarms and pestilence. This is, of course, highly speculative and far from proven, but it forces a profound shift in perspective. It asks us to see history not as a series of isolated events, but as an interconnected tapestry where a single thread, pulled by a volcano on a Greek island, could unravel societies across continents. How many ancient collapses that we attribute to war or poor leadership were actually the final, desperate acts of civilizations pushed over the edge by a climate crisis they could not possibly understand? The ash clouds from Thera eventually cleared, but some civilizations were buried by a slower, more insidious force than any volcano. The land itself was turning against them. In the heart of Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent that first nurtured civilization, a quiet poison was rising from the ground. This was not a dramatic fire from the sky or a sudden earthquake, but a slow-motion cataclysm of its own making, the salinization of the soil. For centuries, the Sumerians and later the Babylonians had mastered the land with a brilliant innovation, vast networks of irrigation canals that channeled the life-giving waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to their fields. Yet this very solution contained the seeds of their long-term decline. Agricultural historians point to a fundamental flaw in the system: irrigation without adequate drainage. With each flood and each controlled watering, mineral salts naturally present in the river water were deposited into the soil. As the water evaporated under the hot sun, the salts were left behind, and without a way to flush them out, they began to accumulate season after season, generation after generation. The water table itself would rise, bringing even more buried salts up to the root zones of the crops, creating a toxic environment where nothing could thrive. We can read this ancient agricultural crisis in the very words they left behind. Cuneiform tablets from the time are filled with lamentations. One farmer writes that the earth has turned white, a stark description of the salt crusting on the surface of his fields. More telling are the records of crop yields. Over the centuries, the data shows a painful and unmistakable decline. At first, the primary grain was wheat, a crop highly sensitive to salt. But as the salinity increased, wheat would no longer grow. The farmers were forced to shift to a more salt-tolerant grain, barley. For a while, this adaptation worked, but even barley has its limits. The yields for barley, too, began to fall, dropping by nearly 2/3 in some regions over a few hundred years. The economic base of these powerful city-states was literally eroding beneath their feet. The great city of once a magnificent capital of empire, provides a sobering example. Archaeological analysis of soil samples taken from the lands that once fed this metropolis show extremely high levels of salinity dating to its period of decline. The fields that supported its bustling population, its armies, and its artisans eventually became so barren they could no longer sustain the city's grandeur. The food surplus that powered the empire vanished, leading to economic collapse, social unrest, and a vulnerability that invited conquest. How does a civilization fall? Sometimes it is not by the sword, but by the slow, inexorable failure of its breadbasket. This ancient story forces us to look at our own world. Modern agriculture from California to Central Asia faces the same fundamental challenge of water management and salt buildup. The question is not whether we are smarter than the Sumerians, but whether we can learn from their centuries-long mistake in time. As the fields of Mesopotamia whitened and fell silent, a different kind of environmental stress was gathering its strength in the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic. For 400 years, the Norse settlements in Greenland stood as a testament to European resilience, two communities of farmers and churchmen clinging to the edge of the known world. Then the cold set in with a new and terrible permanence. The onset of the Little Ice Age was not a single storm, but a creeping, century-long stranglehold that slowly broke their society. Ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet itself tell this story with brutal clarity, showing a dramatic and sustained drop in temperatures right at the time the colonies were failing. The growing seasons, already brief, became impossibly short. Pastures that once supported their cattle and sheep yielded less and less grass each year. The Norse were caught in a vicious cycle of hunger, their way of life becoming a death sentence. Their cultural identity was deeply rooted in being European Christians, a self-image that tragically prevented them from adapting. They wore woolen clothing suited for a colder Scandinavia, but not for the deepening Arctic chill. They persisted in building stone churches and raising livestock, a pastoral economy that was failing before their eyes, while all around them the Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, thrived. The Thule wore tailored skins, hunted seals and whales from nimble kayaks, and possessed technologies perfectly adapted to the extreme environment. The Norse viewed them with suspicion, calling them Skraelings, and largely refused to learn from them. This cultural rigidity proved fatal. As the cold intensified, the sea ice expanded, creating a formidable barrier. The vital trade routes back to Iceland and Norway, the lifelines that brought them iron, timber, and symbolic connection to the homeland, were increasingly blocked. Archaeological evidence from the final years of the settlements is heartbreaking. They began to reuse old tools until they were worn to nothing. They resorted to making implements from whalebone, a desperate substitute for the steel they could no longer import. Analysis of human skeletal remains from the latest graves shows clear signs of chronic malnutrition and increasing physiological stress. Their bodies were literally wasting away. The final haunting record we have is not one of tragedy but of normalcy, a church record from 1408 documenting a wedding in the eastern settlement. After that, there is only an archaeological silence. The settlements were found empty by later sailors, the last Norse having either perished or departed, leaving their stone longhouses to the encroaching ice. Their story forces a chilling question upon us. What deeply held practices and beliefs do we cling to today? What economic dependencies and cultural identities that might prevent us from adapting to our own changing world? While Greenland fell to a slow, creeping freeze, another civilization met its end in a sudden, fiery collapse that echoes to this day. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro were a marvel of ancient urban planning, a grid of baked brick houses with sophisticated drainage running beneath them. Yet around 1900 years before the Common Era, this great city of the Indus Valley fell into a silence from which it never recovered. The mystery is not that it ended, but how something so meticulously built could be so completely abandoned. For decades, the leading theory pointed to a violent invasion. Archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler, examining a collection of skeletons found scattered in the streets, famously declared they were the victims of a massacre, pointing to a decisive conquest by Aryan invaders from the north. He saw the Vedic hymns of the time, which spoke of storming fortified places, as a corroborating text. This narrative of a warlike end held sway for a long time. But as with so many ancient mysteries, the story grew more complex upon closer inspection. Later researchers questioned this interpretation, noting that the so-called massacre layer contained only a few dozen skeletons, a tiny number for a city that once housed tens of thousands. The bodies showed no concentrated signs of battle trauma, and they were found in various positions, some even in abandoned buildings, suggesting they may have been victims of a sudden disaster, not a military slaughter. The truth seems to lie not in a single cataclysm, but in a slow, multi-causal unraveling. The environmental evidence is compelling. Geological surveys reveal thick layers of silt surrounding the city's higher levels, pointing to repeated, catastrophic flooding of the Indus River. Imagine the chaos as monsoon patterns shifted, bringing relentless rains that the city's brilliant drains could not handle. The very river that gave life to the civilization was now drowning its greatest achievement. Compounding this, there is strong evidence that the Indus River began to change its course, slowly moving away from the city. This would have been a death sentence in slow motion. Without a reliable water source for agriculture and trade, the city's economic foundation crumbled. The archaeological record shows a clear decline in the long-distance trade with Mesopotamia that had once brought immense wealth. The meticulous civic standards began to degrade, with later structures being built haphazardly, sometimes even over the main streets, a sure sign of a loss of central authority and communal pride. So, did Mohenjo-Daro fall to a conqueror's sword or to a changing climate? The answer is likely both and neither. It was a cascade of failures. The environmental stresses of floods and river shifts weakened the social and economic fabric, making the city vulnerable. This vulnerability may have then invited raids or internal conflict, delivering the final blow to a society already on its knees. The people did not vanish. They simply walked away from the grand urban experiment, their culture gradually absorbed into smaller, rural communities. How can we ever pinpoint a single cause for a civilization's end when the evidence is often just fragments in the dust? While the fate of Mohenjo-Daro remains shrouded in a complex web of possibilities, the collapse of the Rapa Nui civilization on Easter Island presents a far clearer and more haunting parable of self-inflicted doom. The colossal stone faces of Easter Island stare inland, their silent gaze holding a terrible secret. This was the most isolated human society on Earth, a people who achieved the impossible by carving and transporting the mighty Moai statues across their small, verdant island. Yet their triumph was followed by a descent into a nightmare of civil war, famine, and even cannibalism. For decades, the story of the Rapa Nui people has served as a stark parable of ecological suicide. The narrative, popularized by thinkers like Jared Diamond, is one of a society that cut down its last tree and sealed its own fate. Pollen analysis from lake sediments tells a devastating story. It reveals that the island was once covered in a vast palm forest, a crucial resource that slowly and then suddenly vanished. The loss of these trees was a death sentence in slow motion. Without timber, the islanders could no longer build the large, seagoing canoes necessary for deep water fishing, cutting off a vital source of protein. Deforestation also led to severe soil erosion, washing away the fertile ground needed to grow crops. As resources vanished, society fractured. The clans, once unified by the shared goal of erecting their ancestral moai, turned on each other. The evidence of this internecine warfare is etched into the landscape itself, with toppled statues, their backs deliberately broken, lying scattered across the island. The most haunting sight is the quarry at Rano Raraku, where nearly 400 unfinished moai remain frozen in the volcanic rock. It is as if the industry of a civilization simply stopped one day, the workers dropping their tools and walking away from their gods. Oral histories of the Rapa Nui people speak of this dark age, a time of chaos where the warrior class, the Matatoa, rose to power and the practice of cannibalism emerged. Yet recent research adds crucial, complicating nuance to this story. Scientists now point to the role of the Polynesian rat, which likely arrived with the first settlers. With no natural predators, these rats would have devoured the seeds of the palm trees, preventing the forest from regenerating. Then came the European contact, which delivered the final, crushing blow. The arrival of slave raiders in the 1860s, followed by introduced diseases, decimated a population that was already struggling, reducing it to just a handful of survivors in a single century. So, was this a simple case of environmental mismanagement, or a perfect storm of ecological fragility and external shock? The story of Easter Island forces us to look at our own world as a closed system, a larger version of that isolated island. How do we manage our own global resources, and what happens when they are gone? This collapse was profoundly shaped by human choices, but some ancient disasters offered no choice at all, arriving with the indiscriminate fury of the cosmos. A different kind of map reveals a forgotten continent, where the South China Sea now rolls, a vast, low-lying expanse of land once stretched, connecting the islands of Indonesia, Borneo, and Java to the Asian mainland. This was Sunderland, a verdant world of lush rainforests and sprawling river systems, a paradise twice the size of India that was home to countless generations of early humans. Its destruction was not swift, but it was absolute, erased not by fire or quake, but by a creeping, relentless tide. For 8,000 years, from roughly 15,000 to 7,000 years ago, the world's coastlines were redrawn as the great ice sheets melted. The sea did not simply rise, it advanced, swallowing over 3 million square miles of prime habitable land. This was a cataclysm in slow motion, a global flood written in real time. Geologists can now chart this lost world with astonishing precision. Using sonar to map the seafloor, they have traced the ghostly outlines of ancient river valleys and long-drowned coastlines. Underwater archaeologists suspect that these submerged plains hold the remains of some of humanity's earliest settlements, perhaps even the first experiments with agriculture, now lying hundreds of feet beneath the waves. The rate of this inundation was not constant. At its peak, the oceans rose at a breathtaking pace, sometimes several meters in a single century. Imagine watching the shoreline your family had known for generations retreat by a football field every year, then 2, then 10. There was no stopping it, only a desperate, continual retreat. This relentless pressure forced massive human migrations, pushing populations inward, cramming them into new territories, and inevitably sparking both cultural exchange and violent conflict as people competed for dwindling space. Could the universal flood myths found in cultures from Mesopotamia to the Americas be the distant, fragmented memory of this global event? The story of a great deluge sent by the gods, survived by a chosen few, echoes across dozens of ancient traditions. These may not be mere allegories, but the inherited trauma of a time when the known world truly was swallowed by water. What stories, what languages, what entire ways of life now lie preserved in the silty deep, lost to us forever? The rising seas of the East created new maps and new peoples through displacement, but as the waters stabilized in the Pacific, a different kind of watery cataclysm was brewing in the confined basin of the Mediterranean. The final chapter of Doggerland was written not by a slow rising tide, but by a single monstrous wave. Around 6,200 years before the Common Era, a catastrophic failure occurred deep under the Norwegian Sea. An enormous section of the continental shelf known as the Storegga Slope, weakened by millennia of accumulating sediment, suddenly gave way. This was not a simple landslide. It was a geological collapse of staggering proportions, involving over 3,000 cubic kilometers of rock, mud, and sediment plunging into the abyssal depths. Marine geologists who have mapped the scar on the seafloor compare the volume of material to a mountain range simply sliding into the ocean. The displacement of such an immense volume of water instantly generated a tsunami, a wave that began its race across the North Sea not as a towering crest but as a submerged wall of energy. As this pulse of destruction approached the shallow coastal shelves, it was forced upwards, building into a wall of water over 20 meters high. Imagine a surge taller than a 5-story building, moving at the speed of a jet aircraft, bearing down on the low-lying plains of Doggerland and the eastern shores of Britain. The wave did not simply wash over the land, it scoured it. The force would have been unimaginable, tearing up soil, flattening forests, and obliterating any living thing in its path. The evidence of this apocalyptic event is preserved in the earth itself. In coastal peat bogs across Scotland, geologists find a startling layer of sand and marine shells sandwiched between ancient plant matter. This sand was ripped from the seafloor and carried miles inland by the wave, a permanent sedimentary record of that terrible day. For the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who called Doggerland home, this tsunami was the end of their world. The plains they had hunted for generations, a landscape that connected them to the rest of Europe, were not just flooded but utterly ravaged. The water retreated, but the low-lying land was left broken and saline, increasingly vulnerable to the still rising post-Ice Age seas. This single event likely delivered the final, decisive blow, completing the separation of Britain from the European mainland within a human lifetime. The poignant proof lies on the seabed, where fishermen's trawls have occasionally brought up ancient artifacts, flint tools, and the bones of mammoths, all that remains of a drowned kingdom. This event forces a chilling reflection on our own modern vulnerabilities. Similar submarine landslides are known to exist today, including the massive Kumba Vieja Ridge off the coast of West Africa. A future collapse there could send a tsunami across the entire Atlantic basin. The Storegga Slide reminds us that the ground beneath the ocean is not always stable, and that the sea can reclaim in an instant what it gave over millennia. Power of water to reshape land is matched only by the power of wind to reshape history. Summer failed to arrive in 1816. In New England, farmers watched snowdrifts blanket their fields in June, while Europe shivered under a perpetually gray sky. This was the year without a summer, a global climatic seizure triggered by a single, distant event. The year before, on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa, Mount Tambora had exploded in the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. The mountain blew itself apart, its peak collapsing and sending a column of ash and gas so high it pierced the stratosphere. There, sulfur dioxide transformed into a veil of sulfate aerosols, a microscopic shield that reflected sunlight back into space and plunged the entire northern hemisphere into a volcanic winter. Climatologists estimate global temperatures dropped by over 2 degrees Fahrenheit, a seemingly small number that shattered agricultural cycles worldwide. The consequences were immediate and desperate. Crop failures led to famine across Europe, sparking food riots in England and France. In the United States, the unending cold and ruined harvests drove thousands of New England farmers to abandon their stony fields forever, joining a great migration westward to the promise of the American Midwest. But this crisis also became a strange cradle for innovation and art. With oats and feed impossibly expensive, a German inventor named Younger Dryas was spurred to develop a new, horseless means of transport, a two-wheeled running machine that was the direct ancestor of the modern bicycle. And in a villa on the shores of Lake Geneva, a group of friends trapped indoors by the relentless, stormy weather decided to pass the time by writing ghost stories. From that confined, gloomy summer emerged Mary Shelley's masterpiece, Frankenstein, a tale of creation and consequence born from a world gripped by an unnatural chill. This forces us to ask a profound question: what unexpected masterpieces or revolutionary technologies might be forged in the crucible of our own future crises? The cold of 1816 was a temporary shock, a 3-year disruption from which the world eventually recovered. But some civilizations were not so lucky, facing a climatic shift that became their permanent reality. Deep beneath the searing sands of the Sahara, the Garamantes built an empire on a secret. In what is now Libya, this sophisticated civilization flourished for more than 1,000 years in the heart of a desert that was once their green savanna. Their mastery was not of the surface but of the depths, where they engineered a labyrinth of underground tunnels known as fagaras. These hand-dug shafts, stretching for thousands of miles, tapped into ancient fossil water, a treasure of rainfall that had seeped into the earth millennia before. For centuries, this hidden river sustained their cities, their farms, and a rich material culture that traded with the Roman Empire for fine glass and pottery. They were hydraulic geniuses in a land of extreme aridity, a testament to human ingenuity pitted against a changing world. Yet their greatest strength contained the seed of their eventual undoing. The Sahara was drying, a slow-motion cataclysm of desertification that turned grasslands to dust over generations. The Garamantes responded by digging deeper and wider, mining their prehistoric water bank with ever more ambitious fagara systems. Archaeologist David Mattingly has used satellite imagery to map the breathtaking scale of these networks, revealing a society entirely dependent on an engineering solution to an environmental crisis. This was a civilization engaged in a race it could not ultimately win. Each new tunnel, each expansion of their agricultural oasis, was drawing down a resource that did not recharge. The fossil water was a finite inheritance, not a renewable river. Over centuries of relentless extraction, the water table began to fall, sinking beyond the practical reach of their technology. Their tunnels ran dry from the bottom up, a silent, creeping disaster that no amount of maintenance could reverse. How does a society watch its lifeblood simply vanish, foot by foot, year by year? The fields that once bloomed in the desert began to shrink. Their economic power waned, and a society that had once been a regional power gradually contracted. By around 700 AD, the Garamantes were a shadow of their former selves, their intricate systems failing. They did not vanish in a dramatic collapse, but were gradually absorbed by incoming Islamic groups, their unique identity dissolving into the broader currents of history. The echoes of their story are unnervingly modern. Today, the same fossil aquifers the Garamantes once tapped are being exploited on an industrial scale by Libya's Great Man-Made River Project, a massive engineering endeavor pumping this ancient water to coastal cities. It poses the same existential question the Garamantes eventually faced: what happens when the well runs dry? Their history is a powerful lesson in the limits of technology. It reminds us that even the most brilliant adaptation can become a trap if it relies on a resource that cannot last, a warning from the past written in the dust of a forgotten kingdom. The stones of Anchor still stand, but some cataclysms leave no stone unturned. From the air, the true genius of the Khmer Empire is finally visible. LiDAR technology, which uses laser pulses to map the ground beneath the dense jungle canopy, has revealed a sprawling metropolis far larger than anyone imagined, a city woven together by a breathtakingly complex web of canals, moats, and reservoirs. This hydraulic network was the empire's beating heart, a masterpiece of engineering designed to tame the monsoon's fury and store its life-giving water for the dry season. It turned seasonal deluge into year-round abundance, allowing Ankara to support a population of perhaps 1 million people at its height. The city's crown jewels were its barrays, massive, hand-excavated reservoirs that mirrored the heavens. The West Barray, for instance, is an artificial lake stretching 8 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide, a body of water so vast it remains one of the largest pre-industrial engineering feats on Earth. Yet this very system of brilliant control contained the seeds of its own destruction. How does a civilization so masterful in its manipulation of water ultimately fall victim to it? The answer lies in a climate that stopped cooperating. The intricate channels and reservoirs were calibrated for a specific pattern of monsoon rains, a rhythm the empire had come to depend on for centuries. But climate records from tree rings and cave formations in the region tell a story of sudden, violent change. A series of intense mega-droughts gripped Southeast Asia, followed by periods of exceptionally intense monsoon rainfall. This 1-2 punch of climatic extremes was more than the system could handle. During the droughts, the vast reservoirs and canals would have silted up, their capacity reduced just when water was most desperately needed. The agricultural base that fed the massive population would have withered, leading to famine and social unrest. Then, when the fierce rains finally came, they would have arrived with catastrophic force. The silt-choked canals could not carry the water away fast enough, and the carefully managed network likely experienced catastrophic breaches. The very barrays designed to prevent flooding may have instead contributed to it, releasing walls of water that scoured the landscape and damaged the city's core infrastructure. We can see the evidence of this slow unraveling in the archaeological record. The magnificent temple of Angkor Wat itself shows signs of emergency modifications, with canals being blocked and rerouted in a frantic attempt to adapt. The city was not sacked and burned by an invading army. It was gradually, painstakingly abandoned. The political and economic center of gravity shifted south to riverine capitals like Phnom Penh, where trade and water were more reliably accessed. The jungle simply crept back in, reclaiming the plazas and palaces, its silence a testament to a system pushed beyond its environmental limits. This raises a haunting question for our own time. We live in an age of immense technological hubris, where we build megacities in deserts and levees along coastlines, believing our engineering can insulate us from nature's variability. The story of Angkor is a powerful reminder that the most sophisticated infrastructure is only as resilient as the climate it was designed for. When that climate shifts, the very systems that enabled greatness can become instruments of collapse. What complex networks sustain our cities today, and how vulnerable are they to a climate that no longer follows the old rules? The reign of the dinosaurs ended with a 1-2 punch of cosmic and geological violence. 66 million years ago, a world ruled by giants was caught between a rock from space and an unimaginable fire from below. While the Chicxulub asteroid impact in Mexico is the famous killer, it may have had a devastating accomplice, the Deccan traps in India. This was not a single volcano, but a series of colossal eruptions that flooded the landscape with lava over and over again, eventually covering an area the size of modern France in layer upon layer of molten rock. Geochemists studying these ancient lava flows can measure the staggering volumes of climate-altering gases they belched into the atmosphere for thousands of years. The debate among scientists is fierce. Was the asteroid the final blow to a world already stressed by volcanic winters and poisoned skies? or was it the sole assassin? The evidence is preserved in a thin, global line in the rock record, the KPG boundary. This layer is a time capsule of catastrophe, rich in the rare element iridium, which is abundant in asteroids but rare on Earth, and also laden with the fine ash from those distant Deccan eruptions. The sequence of destruction is almost too horrific to comprehend. The initial asteroid impact created a global firestorm, and then an impact winter as dust blocked the sun. But just as the planet might have begun to recover, the prolonged volcanic activity of the Deccan Traps would have prolonged the misery, swinging the climate from a deep freeze into a runaway greenhouse, all while acid rain fell from the skies. The foundation of the entire food web, from microscopic plankton to the leaves on the trees, collapsed. In the fossil record, we see the stunningly rapid disappearance of the great non-avian dinosaurs. But we also see the small, furry survivors, the early mammals, who scurried through the darkness and emerged into a vacant world. Their survival was a matter of chance, of being small enough to hide and adaptable enough to eat anything. This deep time perspective forces a humbling realization. The dominance of our own species, the entire trajectory of human history, rests on the fragile thread of that ancient lottery. If that asteroid had arrived a few minutes earlier or later, if the volcanoes had been quieter, the world might still belong to the descendants of Tyrannosaurus rex. These planetary resets are not anomalies. They are a fundamental part of Earth's story, reminding us that the ground beneath our feet and the sky above are never truly permanent. The legend of Ubar was a whispered warning for centuries, a tale of a city of immense wealth and wickedness punished by being swallowed whole by the desert sands. The Atlantis of the sands was more than a myth. It was a major hub of the ancient frankincense trade, a place where fortunes were made from the aromatic resin that was as valuable as gold. Its sudden disappearance became a powerful moral fable, but the truth was far more terrifying. The ground beneath the city literally opened up and consumed it. Archaeologist Joris Zarins led a modern quest to find the lost city, using a powerful new tool for the time, satellite imagery. The photographs revealed something startling: ancient caravan tracks, invisible from the ground, all converging on a single, remote spot in modern-day Oman. When the team investigated, they found the ruins of a formidable fortress, but something was terribly wrong. The walls were not simply crumbling, they were collapsed inward, as if the earth had been pulled out from under them. The evidence pointed to a catastrophic sinkhole. The city had been built atop a vast limestone cavern, a natural feature common in the region. For generations, the people of Ubar thrived, but their very success sealed their doom. To support the city's population and its surrounding agricultural fields, they relentlessly drew water from the underground aquifer. This over-extraction of groundwater slowly dissolved the limestone pillars supporting the cavern roof. The city, in its thirst, was unknowingly sawing away at the very foundations of its existence. One day, the cavern could no longer hold the weight, and the roof gave way. The central part of the city, its heart and its homes, plummeted into the chasm, with the outer walls collapsing inward after it. The desert sands then did the rest, quickly blowing in to fill the void and seal the tomb. This geological explanation does not entirely dismiss the old folk tales, however. The stories of Ubar's destruction due to the immorality of its people can be seen as a way to explain an event that was otherwise incomprehensible. How else could a society so powerful be wiped out so completely if not by divine retribution? The archaeological finds at the site confirm its identity and its tragic end. They uncovered evidence of the lucrative frankincense trade, along with the shattered remnants of buildings that tell a story of sudden, violent collapse. This ancient disaster echoes loudly in our own time. We see the same phenomenon today in places like Florida and Mexico City, where sinkholes suddenly open up, swallowing cars and even buildings, often triggered by the overuse of groundwater. The story of Ubar forces us to ask a difficult question. Are we, in our modern cities, also testing the limits of the ground we build upon? The desert reclaimed Ubar in a single, dramatic collapse, just as the jungle patiently reclaimed the sprawling metropolis of Anchor. Both fell not to external enemies, but to the unforeseen consequences of their own brilliant adaptations. The city of Tiwanaku stood as a marvel of high-altitude adaptation, its stone temples and monoliths reflecting in the deep blue waters of Lake Titicaca. For centuries, this empire flourished in the thin air of the Andes, a seeming master of its challenging environment. Yet around 1,000 years after the Common Era, its urban heart was abandoned, its people scattered. The empire did not fall to an invasion, but to a slow, relentless withdrawal of the very water that gave it life. Paleolimnologists, scientists who study the history of lakes, have drilled deep into the sediments of Lake Titicaca, reading its past like a book. Their cores reveal a stark truth. A prolonged and devastating drought caused the lake level to drop dramatically, a regression that coincided precisely with Tiwanaku's collapse. This was not a simple dry spell, but a climatic shift that broke the empire's backbone. The genius of Tiwanaku was its agricultural system, the Suka Collis. These were not ordinary fields, but a grid of raised earth platforms separated by water-filled canals. The system was a masterpiece of microclimate engineering, where the water absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, protecting crops from frost, while the decaying aquatic plants in the canals provided a continuous source of natural fertilizer. It was a self-sustaining cycle of abundance, but it had one critical vulnerability: an absolute dependence on a consistently high water table fed by the lake. As the drought stretched for decades, the lake level fell, and the regional water table dropped with it. The canals in the Suka Collis network began to dry up. The protective warmth and the free fertilizer vanished. The fields that had once produced bumper harvests of potatoes and quinoa now lay exposed and barren. The sophisticated knowledge that had sustained a civilization for generations was rendered useless by a change in the weather. The archaeological record at the city itself tells a story of quiet desperation. The grand construction projects, the carving of new monoliths, and the expansion of temples all cease abruptly. The urban core, once a bustling center of ceremony and power, shows signs of gradual depopulation. There is no layer of ash from a great fire, no mass graves from a battle, just the silent, stubborn evidence of people leaving, one family at a time, until the city was empty. They did not vanish, they dispersed, migrating to lower, wetter valleys and merging with other communities. The modern revival of the Suka Collis offers a poignant glimpse into what was lost. Local farmers, collaborating with archaeologists, have reconstructed these ancient fields. The results are astonishing. The revived Suka Collis produce yields several times higher than conventional plots in the same region. This success proves the system's brilliance, but it also highlights its fragility. It forces us to look at our own world and ask a difficult question. Where are our own Suka Collis? What brilliantly engineered agricultural systems do we depend on that are critically vulnerable to a single, predictable climate shift? The people of Tiwanaku could not have known the global forces shifting their weather, but we have no such excuse. Their story is a monument to human ingenuity and a sobering lesson in the peril of building a civilization on a single, fragile ecological niche. The mighty walls of Mycenae were designed to withstand any army, but they could not defend against the earth itself. Around 1,200 years before the Common Era, a series of violent earthquakes rocked the Greek mainland, delivering a critical blow to the very heart of the Mycenaean world. Archaeoseismologists, scientists who study ancient earthquakes, have examined the ruins of citadels like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Medea, finding telltale signs of ground shaking. They note how massive cyclopean walls, built from boulders so large they were thought to be the work of giants, were not simply toppled but cracked and displaced in a specific, uniform direction, a pattern characteristic of seismic force, not human attackers. At Tiryns, the sheer scale of the stonework is staggering, yet sections of these impregnable defenses were shifted entirely off their foundations, as if shoved by a giant, invisible hand. This seismic violence did more than crack palace walls. It shattered the infrastructure that held the kingdom together. Roads vital for moving troops and trade goods were fractured and blocked by landslides. Elaborate water management systems, including underground cisterns crucial for surviving sieges, were likely damaged or destroyed, cutting off the lifeblood of the citadel. In an instant, the central authority of the Wanax, the Mycenaean king, was profoundly undermined. How could a ruler claim divine favor or maintain control when his very palace, the symbol of his power, lay broken and exposed? The earthquakes created a power vacuum, shaking the confidence of the people and crippling the state's ability to respond to the next crisis. That crisis arrived swiftly. With their defenses compromised and central authority weakened, the Mycenaean citadels became vulnerable. The seismic disaster was the first domino to fall, making the subsequent waves of invasion and migration by the so-called Sea Peoples not the sole cause of collapse, but a fatal symptom of a civilization already in shock. The intricate web of long-distance trade that brought tin for bronze and luxury goods from across the Mediterranean disintegrated, as ports were damaged and trust between kingdoms evaporated. The fire that scoured the palaces of Mycenae and Pylos may well have been set by human hands, but those hands were likely taking advantage of a society already brought to its knees by the earth shaker. The ruins stand as a stark monument to a terrifying truth, that the ground beneath our feet is never truly solid, and that the most formidable walls are no match for the planet's unrest. The Great Mound at Cahokia still rises from the Illinois floodplain, a silent earthwork that once looked down upon a bustling city of tens of thousands. This was the heart of a vast Mississippian culture, a metropolis that thrived for centuries before its people simply walked away. The mystery of its abandonment now points to a cycle of betrayal by the very river that gave it life. Geoarchaeologists drilling into the soil of the American bottom have uncovered a telling story. Layers of thick flood sediment deposited right at the time Cahokia's power was waning. The Mississippi and its tributaries were not just highways for trade. They were unpredictable forces that could reclaim their gifts in a single, devastating season. A major flood would have been an existential crisis, drowning the vast agricultural fields that fed the city, contaminating the freshwater stores with silt and waste, and washing away the carefully maintained causeways and canals that connected this sprawling urban center. Imagine the chaos as the waters receded, leaving behind not fertile soil, but a landscape of mud-choked ruin with food stores destroyed and the drinking supply poisoned. This environmental shock likely amplified other simmering problems. The city's growth had already led to local deforestation and perhaps overhunting, stretching resources thin. A single catastrophic flood could have shattered the social contract, eroding faith in the rulers who were supposed to maintain cosmic and earthly order. At the outlying East St. Louis Mound Group, part of the Greater Cahokia Complex, archaeologists found that the site was not just abandoned, but ritually sealed with a clean layer of clay after a flood, as if the people were formally closing a chapter of their history, conceding that the land was no longer safe for their community. How many of our own great cities, built on the very same fertile floodplains, are engaged in the same precarious negotiation? We construct levees and dams, believing we have tamed the rivers, but the story of Cahokia whispers a warning from the past. The mounds remain not as monuments to human triumph, but as tombstones for a metropolis that learned the hard way that nature always has the final say. 26 forgotten cataclysms paint a stark portrait of human history. The grand arc of our past is not a smooth line of progress, but a series of dramatic peaks and deep valleys, each trough marking a point where the planet itself intervened. From the cosmic fire of the Younger Dryas to the creeping desertification of the Garamontes, these events reveal a humbling truth. Our greatest civilizations have always existed at the mercy of Earth's dynamic and often violent systems. These are not just stories of tragedy, but profound lessons in resilience. The survivors of these collapses, from the dispersed ancestral pueblones to the reinvented cultures after the Bronze Age collapse, demonstrate a remarkable human capacity to adapt, to start again with the fragments left behind. The phoenix does not always rise from the ashes, but something new and different often does. This understanding forces us to look at our own modern world with clear eyes. We have built a global civilization of staggering complexity, one that is deeply interconnected and incredibly specialized, just like the Maya with their water reservoirs or the Khmer with their hydraulic cities. Our vulnerability is not that we are weak, but that we are so brilliantly adapted to a very specific set of environmental conditions. The philosopher George Santayana's warning echoes across the millennia. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Our exploration of these forgotten resets is not an academic exercise. It is a vital tool for navigating an uncertain future. By listening to the whispers from the dust and the warnings from the ice, we can recognize the patterns. We can see the fragility in our own systems and perhaps with wisdom build a society that is not just powerful but resilient, one that can bend without breaking when the next great change inevitably comes. We would love to hear which of these cataclysms resonated most with you in the comments below. And for more journeys into the mysteries of our past, be sure to subscribe.